New Realities. I'm here with a panel of experts to talk about the latest release or the Pentagon's admission that there was actual footage that it was in their possession that was taken of a UFO. So Nick Pope, Jan Herzon, Grant Cameron, and Dr. JJ Hurtak are real leading experts. But let's start with you, Nick, about what you have to say about this new disclosure from the Pentagon.
Well, it's fascinating because, of course, these three videos of US Navy jets chasing UFOs have been in the public domain for 2.5 years now. And the Department of Defense was under no pressure and no obligation to make a statement about this. And yet, on April 27th, they did so. And they said, we are putting this statement out to clear up any misunderstanding about these videos and their provenance. But of course, you know, that's not what's happened at all. It hasn't cleared up any misunderstanding. If anything, it's led to further questions. Why is it, and this is not the first time, by the way, that the US government, every time the story of these Navy UFO encounters and the associated story of the Pentagon's ATIP program, every time that story looks as if it's dying down, the government itself throws gasoline on the fire and keeps it going. So the real question here, I think, is not so much, though we can get into this, I'm sure, what's in the videos and what's going on, but why is it that the US government is driving the story? Their use of the word unauthorized to describe the previous release is interesting. I think it's a shot across the bows, and I think it's part of a process whereby they are saying, look, we are not going to be reacting and following the narrative of the New York Times, to the Stars Academy, whoever it is. We are going to be front and center. And if anyone is going to be driving the narrative on UFOs and associated issues, it's us.
Okay, before I go further, I have Grant Cameron, Canadian investigator, Jan Herzon, the director of MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, and Dr. JJ and Desiree Hurtak, futurists and real investigators on the subject. I am going to show what Nick is talking about, which was the New York Times, December 16th, 2017 headline that people weren't sure was where they came from. Of course, it says, if you see there on the screen, U.S. Defense Department release. This is, Grant, you just want to tell people what we're going to see here? Do you mind?
What we're going to see?
In this New York Times video of what's called the Tic Tac.
Yeah, this is the Nimitz. This is the chase where they have the object sits there for a week and then they go to chase it and they pick it up and they capture it on film.
Okay, well, here it is, and we'll talk about it.
Dude, that's a fucking drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude. That's not on us, though, is it? It's not. It is on us, dude. Well, if there's look at that thing. It's rotating.
Okay, anyway, that is what the Pentagon has just said. Yes, that is one of our videos. So, Jan, do you want to jump in on what really just happened with the Pentagon's acknowledgement?
Well, personally, what I believe is that they're trying to correct an error because there was a person within our community who was challenging the Pentagon to come clean with whether Lou Elizondo was real or not, and got some bad information that the TTSA and Lou Elizondo were not who they said they were. Then there was a Popular Science article by another gentleman who crawled through and came up with all the documentation, which basically threw it back in the face, in my opinion, of the Pentagon, that they didn't have their information correct. So I'm sure someone up the top said, straighten this out and get the right information out. Now, what I've been told about the videos back from the very beginning was they were never classified. That's why they were able to be released. They were marked highly sensitive, which is a different classification than a classified document. And so Lou Elizondo was able to take it through a different process, a backdoor process, if you will, for highly classified things, and got these things released. And of course, when they hit the press back in December 16th of 2017, I am sure it was a shock to most of the people in the Pentagon that these were even out in the public.
but
That's the narrative I've been told. That's the narrative that I personally believe. I don't work for the Pentagon. I don't know everything that goes on in the hallowed halls of our military establishment, but I think this was basically an attempt to correct some misinformation that had been put out officially by the Pentagon, which was wrong. And that's
but
what
how
I
could
see.
it say, how could it say under the New York Times article, U.S. Department of Defense? It actually says that. It still does on the New York Times. Is there anything?
You're talking about back in 2017, or you're talking about the one that came
I've talked about 2017. It says U.S. Department of Defense right there in the article. So obviously the New York Times must have checked it out with the Department of Defense in order to give them the credit, right? Or are we missing something?
This was the article by Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Keene. I'm not privy to all the investigation that they did prior to releasing the article, but they obviously coordinated with a bunch of different people, including TTSA, Chris Mellon, Lou Elizondo, and I'm sure people within the Pentagon to put that article out originally. But I mean, the Pentagon's like, I worked for IBM for 37 years, 400,000 employees. The one employee here doesn't know what the employee over there is doing. I'm sure it's the same way at the Pentagon. The person over here doesn't know what the person over there is doing. And what I come to learn, the more and more I'm in this field, is that we have very siloed things going on across the gamut, which is why this person here, I mean, I had people in the intelligence community come to me and say, I'm shocked that this program ATIP existed because I should have known about it. Well, you don't know about it because you weren't read into the program. So, I mean, Nick could talk to this better than I could, and I'm sure Grant, these classified programs, they're quite interesting to me. I'd love to know what's going on. I guess the better question I would ask is, when are we going to see the 4th, 5th, and 6th video?
Well, before we get to that, let me just get JJ and Desiree Hurtak to jump in there and say, what do you think is really happening, not just with the release, but the acknowledgement? I mean, Nick touched on this, but in your opinion, because you've been investigating this field.
We've looked at this for 48 years. I think there's going to be an avalanche of new material being released. I worked in foreign countries. I was able as a field researcher to bring back documents like I'm showing here from the Brazilian government of 14 unidentified spacecraft over a nuclear facility in Brazil. This was unknown even to the public at that time, but essentially most of the information goes into a hamper and it's lost forever. But now we see a breath of fresh air, so to speak, coming from the Pentagon. They recognize something's happening with other government programs in disclosure. So I think they're trying to logically prepare the American public for a bigger story.
Right. It's interesting they did it right during the coronavirus. I mean, they could have waited a few more weeks and then it would have been viral. And that's why it's so important we do what we're doing today to tell people, yes, that the Pentagon has confirmed that film footage. And I think that's important because even though, yeah, it's valid, it said Department of Defense underneath it, but now there's really no denying it. Nobody out there can deny, even with these young kids flying in the airplanes, the Hornets said, that there's a whole fleet of them, which is an amazing thing, that they didn't just see one little thing going by. And you look at it, you didn't show the whole film footage. We encourage everyone to go out there and look at the whole thing. But there, you see the water because they're kind of close to the water, and you see the guy trying to lock on. So two of them, or maybe it's the same one, goes by and then he finally locks onto it. So these things are going fast. They're going amazing how they're turning and twisting. It's not ours. And that's the big question. Everyone says, oh, it's probably the US government's. But then Pentagon saying it's unidentified, which means it's not ours.
Well, let me talk to Grant because he's been following the whole government cover up. He has a whole thing called UFO presidential.com, I think it's what it's called, where he follows each president's ideas and facts that have been presented during those administrations about UFOs. So Grant, you see them coming forward and taking things back. What is your analysis of this situation?
Well, I see, and make a statement. I wrote about this before the New York Times article. I put out Managing Magic was almost a year before. I identified Jim Semivan. I said they were going to drop this thing. I said that Podesta and Obama and Hillary Clinton were behind this. It was all spelled out. So I was being told this was going to be dropping. So it was no surprise to me. I say they've been doing this since 1947 when they gave two 8x11 photographs, gun camera footage photographs to Kenneth Arnold from the 4th Air Force and told him this is UFOs. And it goes into the 1950s when Disney was given the job to do a UFO documentary. Bob Emenegger was given a documentary in the 1970s, and he told me that the Holloman Air Force Base film was declassified. It was not classified as well. And then you have Bill Moore come along, and he's got these 24 people, and he's leaking material. And so I say it's like wash, rinse, and repeat. They just keep doing the same thing again. They put stuff out, they pull it back. Like when the New York Times article came out, you got to remember that there was two different names. So the Washington Post went the same day as the New York Times, and they had a different name for the program than the New York Times. So they're using sources inside the Pentagon. And when we mention the government, you always have to keep in mind, because I know most of the people that were in this thing. I've known about them. I first wrote about the Avery in 1989, and all the names of these guys, and it's the same guys. And when you're talking about the government, you're not talking about one entity. For example, right now, you have two official stories inside the United States of America about where the virus comes from. And so it really doesn't matter. A couple of years ago, the White House made an official statement from the Office of the Science Advisor that there were no UFOs. There was no UFO program. And so they put it out, they pull it back, and that's what they want, is this plausible deniability. The question was brought up, why would they bring it out in the middle of the virus? That's part of the pattern. That's when they dropped the New York Times article was on December 16th. They drop it just before all the reporters go on holidays for Christmas, the same as when they shut down Blue Book. They just shut it down on December the 17th when there's no reporters around and it's not going to go viral. It's the idea is you put it out, but you don't want, because if you want the story out, you can stand the president, you can stand the CIA director up and tell them they don't want it out. They sort of want it out. They want people just to have this sort of thing where nobody really knows what's going on, where the story's getting out, and you have plausible deniability. Because if everybody knows that the president is running the show, that he's covering this thing up, it's all over. They want people to think that there's some sort of thing inside the government. And my work with people inside the government, because I knew of a lot of these people like Semi Van and dealt with Hal Puthoff and Kit Green and all these guys over the years. And I know that there's people inside the government who want the material out. So I don't see the government putting this out. I see a group inside the government who is pushing an agenda, like John Podesta is pushing an agenda. And so this would be somebody inside the government, because a lot of people, when you start looking at the presidential records, you don't see evil guys who are trying to distract the people. You see people who are doing the best they can with the job they've got. And somebody inside the government wants the truth told at one specific point. So it's not the government, it's people inside the government.
Let me talk to a guy who was inside the government, not our government, but the British Ministry of Defense. I also want to comment before I talk to Nick. December 17th, the Blue Book was closed, 1989, December 17th. That was the day that story was released to the public. So I'm just interested in that. But Nick, I want to talk to you about inside the government. What is their strategy for releasing, I mean, from your experience, releasing information, taking it back, putting it out there? I mean, what goes on for inside that organization, that control?
Well, the first point, speaking about the British government, is that we have already declassified and released around about 60,000 pages of UFO-related documents, most of which have been put out without any redactions, not all, but most, released to the National Archives in the UK. And I came out of retirement to help with that. I did some spokesperson work, I did some media interviews, and we saw it as a good opportunity to showcase our commitment to open government and freedom of information. And some of the UFO-related documents that were released were highly classified at the time. So, for example, the intelligence assessment of the phenomenon, colloquially known as Project Condign, but formerly titled United unidentified aerial phenomena in the UK air defense region. And recently, of course, the US government has confirmed that, as they put it, they borrowed the term UAP from us Brits. But there's a lot of material. If people go through some of the material in Project Condine's final report, there's a real read across into some of the ATIP documentation, particularly in relation to technology acquisition, the sorts of things that a better understanding of the UFO phenomenon, whatever we think its true nature is, could tell us, and what the spin-offs might be in terms of what we in the Ministry of Defense termed, quote, novel military applications, unquote. And the report referenced what Russia and China was doing into all that as well. So the basic position is this. I think governments all around the world are declassifying and releasing where they can. And clearly what we see with these 3 videos and with some of the ATIP documentation is it's not a single event, it's a process. And we have taken some interesting steps, and there are some further interesting steps to come. I mean, I think one of you, I can't remember who it was, somebody said, well, what about the other videos? Absolutely. I don't think anyone's kidding ourselves that there have only been 3 incidents where US military aircraft have encountered and filmed UFOs. I mean, nonsense. If you look at what the Navy themselves said when they released guidance to pilots about what to do if they encounter these things, they haven't released the specific guidance, of course, but they've confirmed it has been issued. And they said, we're doing this in response to what they termed as an ongoing series of incursions into restricted military airspace. So if you'll forgive the pun, this is not a tip of the iceberg, it's the tip of the iceberg.
Right. So thank you, Nick. So Jan, you're the head of a national organization that's really focused on this, MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and you've been following this personally. You've had your own sightings. What do you think the government's trying to do to kind of manipulate our minds or condition us or somehow open us up? Where do you think that's headed?
Well, you know, Lou spoke at our 2018 symposium, and he said something that really resonated with me. He said that it's not the purpose of government to satisfy the idle curiosity of its citizens. It's the purpose of government to protect its citizens. So I think, you know, we've built a military with the purpose of protecting us. We've built an intelligence community for the purposes of hopefully keeping us safe. It's really going to take the people to come forward and push this forward. So, you know, and I know Grant may have other opinions and Nick may have other opinions, but I see that we owe a debt of gratitude, frankly, in my opinion, to the guys likenesses of Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo, who are brave enough to step forward, because I tell you, there's no fame and fortune in talking about this subject to the general public. You get faced with derision, even today. Despite the announcements that have been made, despite the press that has been given to this subject, the average citizen, at least 50% of them, still don't believe anything has ever visited this planet. I mean, I talked to large groups. I asked that question right up front. How many people believe there's life somewhere far away in the universe, at least as intelligent as us? 100% of the hands go up. But when I asked the second question, which is, how many people believe at some time in the distant past, ancient times, or now, that life has ever visited Earth, I only get half of the hands to go up. So we still have half of the people on this planet who don't think there's anything to this. And we know for a fact there is.
But I have to say, we've been lied to. If the government would have come out with the truth, there'd be 100% of those hands going up. So the fact that, yes, some of these people are heroes to come out, but great, but we are left still with lies and cover-ups and not the real history of us as a planetary civilization. So Dr. Hurtak and Desiree, you want to talk to that for a second?
Well, can I say one thing?
I'll go first.
Go ahead, Jan.
Go, Jan. I want to say one thing before you go to Hurtak. You know, the intelligence community has spent 60 years basically debasing this whole question of UFOs, right? I mean, intelligence operations, making people look foolish. make me people die if they don't follow the right. I mean, we've seen 60 years of this happening. And so every time the public gets something credible, they're told by very important people, you know, whoever that might be, scientists, that there's no way this could possibly be true. So we've conditioned our population that this isn't real for 60 years. It's not going to flip overnight. I mean, there's a reason why they're calling it UAP. It's because they've so poisoned the UFO field that if you say the word UFO, they think you're a nut. You can't go to Capitol Hill and talk to senators about UFOs. You can go to Capitol Hill and talk to them about UAPs. Well, I got news for you. UAP equals UFO. Anyhow,
Right.
I'll leave it there.
It's a rebranding. It's a total rebranding. And I think it's
Exactly.
probably good marketing. So JJ, what were you saying?
I was going to say, you know, Nick mentioned there's more film footage, and of course, this event, the Nimitz event that we saw the film footage of, took place in 2004. But they've also mentioned that there was a whole month, and this was a whole week actually, that those events that we were talking about, the Nimitz, took place November 10th and November 16th. The 14th was where the film footage, I think, was shot from. But in 2014, off the coast of the Atlantic coast of the US, there was also several months of these young kids flying these planes, seeing these unusual objects, and they were reported as well. We don't have the film footage of that. So people really need to listen to programs like this, get on with what's happening. And it's interesting, I find that they're always going into the most recent stuff. We'll say 2014, 2014. They're not going back to the past, because I think it would be too much to uncover the majority of data that they actually have going back to the 1940s. So I'm happy if they just start doing, you know, this century, that's fine. And there's a lot to come out with.
There's definitely a psychological and sociological backdrop to much of this that's being, quote unquote, declassified. And I go back many years ago when I knew one of the admirals at a very high level, Admiral Golfardi, who explained that there's just a whole area that cannot be released at that time. This is back in the 1950s. So to put it in a practical way, we need to orientate the public with a psychological and a sociological preparation. I do not think this is being adequately addressed, as Jan just said. There's too many, so we say, put downs. And so realistically speaking, great engineers, even astronauts, have been somewhat reluctant to tell their story before camera.
But I have to say, you know, it's very important to realize that, you know, they've been here for a long time. They haven't really harmed us. The military does know about it. People have individuals, what MUFON does, reports on all the reports that have gone on. Jan, how many reports have you guys reported on? I mean, all the people that have seen this all over the world.
Well over 100,000. We're getting 500 to 1,000 reports a month. Now, I have to be honest, probably 90% of those, when you really crawl into them, we could put on the side. I mean, we're getting Starlink reports, we're getting Venus reports, but there is that 5 to 10% that is really what I would say potentially positively not from here.
Well, Grant, I want to ask you what you think is going on as far as the government strategy. And do you feel this has been a real breakthrough, or is it the same old thing?
Well, I call it Bill Moore on steroids. I mean, they're much more effective this time than they were before. You got to remember that the Nimitz film was rolled out in 2007, and according to Eric Davis, it was the guy that picked up the radar data on the Nimitz, and they leaked it to that German production company, and it didn't spin. So they've done it again. And as I go back even to Bob Emenegger in the 1973, when he was given the Holloman Air Force film, he had it in his possession. He was told about this channeling of the alien at the CIA. He was given a bunch of material. He put out the documentary. And when I asked him, I said, did you had to give the film back? And then they put in 8 seconds of the film in the actual documentary. I said, was there any other films? Did you give all the other films back? And he said, no, we had the one from the launch from Vandenberg Air Force Base. I said, you got the film? He said, yeah, I think Alan's got it. And I know that James Fox negotiated to try to put that film. That was a film that was given to them. They said they could have any film they wanted. So people are thinking this is something new. It's like, wow, you know, they did this. To me, it's like, it's the same story. In fact, Bob Emenegger tells a story that he did the documentary in the 1970s. And in 1983, he's contacted by Paul Chartle, the security manager at Norton Air Force Base, where they keep all the film for all the military. And he says, the government liked what you did in the 1970s. We'd like you to do it again. And he said, again? What do you mean? Is this, who's this? Is this Reagan behind this? And he said, you know, he wouldn't answer the question. He got pulled in there, and they bring in, Jacques Vallée's written about this. G. Allen Hynek was brought in, and a guy by the name of General Glenn E. Miller was in there with Paul Shartle, and he said to Shartle, he said, I want you to pull all the UFO film for Hynek. Pull all the film. And he said, sorry, General, I can't do that. You need a requisition. He said, God damn, I'll have your ass. You pull the film for Hynek. You're going to show him the UFO film. So you got to remember, this is not the first rodeo for these guys. And they've done it. They're very effective. I will give them credit because I wrote about it before they did it. I was being told, I had an inside source. I knew what was going on. And it was very, very effective what they've done, how they got the New York Times, the Politico, and Washington Post, who had never done an article. And that was the whole deal, is once you get the New York Times to do the story, suddenly it's like, oh, the New York Times is talking about it. It must be for real. But you got to remember that 3 newspapers went on that day, not just the New York Times. Therefore, this is a coordinated effort, and it was done highly effective. And they have moved the ball down the field. Because I remember I wrote an article called The 64 Reasons the Government has Decided Not to Tell the Truth. And I remember Stephen Greer was saying, oh, the stock market will melt down. The religious people will all go nuts. And then New York Times comes and says, yeah, they got a UFO program. It was for real. What happened? Absolutely nothing. Everybody went, I knew that already. Yeah, no problem. I knew that already. And they've acclimatized the people. And that was the NASA document from the 1960s that said, if you realize there was extraterrestrial life, you have to acclimatize the people before you go public. That's an old document.
Right. JJ, you had a comment, and then we'll go.
Yes, I talked to Nathan Twining Jr., the son of General Twining.
On Majestic 12.
And he said that the Holloman film was correct and that there were other ETs at the base when the film was made. So there's more to the story, but also I talked to a relative of Rod Serling, who was supposed to be the narrator when this was to be officially released, who also validated the fact that there were more involved in the so-called repression of that sterling event that was going to bring the American public into realization that we had cosmic friends visiting our base. The question we have to go back to, again, this is something, Grant, you raised again, is the psychological, and if I may say this more recently, the so-called metaphysical or the spiritual ramifications of what this means to the world at large. Do we go ahead with the whole new psychology or futurism? How do we handle the real McCoy?
But it sounds like they're doing a good job because they keep releasing and no one, and the stock market's gone up. So they must be
well,
doing
and so recently, of course. But let me go ahead, Joe. Go ahead, Grant. Yeah.
Can I make a point? I forgot with my train of thought. Shoot. Okay, go ahead. I had a thought about what they were just talking about there.
Oh.
But it escaped me.
Well, let's hear what Nick has to say.
Future shock has to be avoided at all costs, according to those who play the game at the top.
I just remember what it was. One of the things I think that's slowing the whole thing down is that people think the government knows everything. They've got it all figured out. But if you take a look at Eric Davis said they shut the program in 1989. They shut it down because they couldn't do anything. It's just got to do with consciousness. And if you see Tom DeLonge goes into the skiff, they say he's going in. They say, yeah, come on down to the skiff. Like, come on. He's going to go into a Lockheed skiff, top secret skiff. And he says, he talks to the head scientist at Lockheed Skunk Works. And the guy says, how do you think it works? And Tom says, I think consciousness is involved. And he said he couldn't shut the guy up. So they know consciousness is involved. They know you fly the craft with your mind. They know this kind of stuff, but they don't have it. So you may have actually seen disclosure. This may be, because this is the whole Trump thing. They give Trump the briefing. The Navy goes in, shows them the videos, and then Trump goes, yeah, whatever, that's an interesting video, but I just still don't believe it. That may be all they really have in terms of telling people. Everybody thinks they've got, they're flying the crafts and we're all over the place. It may be that you've seen disclosure. UFOs are real. Even if you go to Jacques Vallée, Hal Puthoff, and Kit Green have the famous core story meeting in the 1980s. There's all this stuff going around the UFO community. So they sit down at the Denny's restaurant, famous story, and they say, there's all this garbage going around. What do we know for sure? The conclusion came to the core story. We are not alone. Something's interacting with us. We have hardware and we aren't getting anywhere with it. And you see that in the Wilson document as well. In the Wilson document that was leaked from Edgar Mitchell's files, you see the same thing. They say, we have no technological ability to back engineer this stuff. It is so far beyond us. So that will stop them from coming out because they're playing the game against the Russians and Chinese and all sorts of other enemies that we're going to try to figure it out before them. So you don't want to let people know what you don't know.
Right. Well,
especially with military budgets being so large, military budgets would be embarrassed. They don't have the wherewithal to explain the details.
I just want to ask Nick, is there, if you've been inside the thinking, I think of those people who are in charge of some of those secrets, is there, I know you only talk from the British point of view perhaps, but is there a plan for disclosure? Everyone agrees the ball is being moved down the field. Would you say from your, let's say, professional opinion that there is a disclosure in place or movement towards that?
Well, I always say that I don't think disclosure is a single event. I think that some people have this rather cliched idea that there's going to be a sort of presidential announcement that will start, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone, that the hangar doors are going to swing open and you're going to see this shit. And people will say, well, this is it. This is disclosure. And I don't think we're going to see that at all. I think Grant touched on it, and I think some of the others did too. Here's how I see it. And the clue, I think, is in the very different attitude that ATIP took, as opposed to, say, Project Blue Book or the MOD's UFO program. Project Blue Book, if we rewind a little bit, came at the UFO phenomenon from the perspective of, let's investigate each and every sighting and see what we think they are. Now, ATIP, and this is my take on it, came at this from a 180-degree different perspective. They came at it from a sort of point of view of, let's take as our start point the reality of this phenomenon. And let's ask ourselves two questions. What are we dealing with in terms of what government would term the threats and the opportunities? And can we acquire any of this technology for ourselves? And if you look at the January 9th, 2018 letter that the Defense Intelligence Agency sent to Congress, just about 2-3 weeks after the Times broke the story, where people like John McCain and Jack Reed and their staffers were saying to DIA, what the heck's going on? You told us we didn't have a UFO program, and now I read that we did. It's clear when you look at the 38 studies that they produced under the ATIP contract, that despite attempts to spin this as being about next generation aviation threats to the US, when you look at what they were actually looking at, anti-gravity, invisibility, warp drive, stargates, wormholes, and the Drake equation. The Drake equation, of course, you could say with some of the other things, well, maybe it's about what Russia or China might have in 40 years. But the Drake equation, there was a paper on the Drake equation. Its only purpose is to estimate how many communicable civilizations there might be in the galaxy. So ATIP, I think, came at it from this different perspective. And I don't know anything about consciousness. It's not my field. But I think Grant and some of the others are right. Maybe they hit a brick wall on this. And maybe the answer is, well, yeah, we think this is real, but at the moment, sorry, we just can't figure it out. And my father was Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor at the Ministry of Defense. And he was an aeronautical engineer by trade. And he always used to point out there is a world of difference between what the theoretical physicists say, which may very well be valid, but the kind of next question is, well, can we build that? Can we engineer it? And sadly, the answer might be, with a lot of this, at the moment, no, we can't.
Can I make one more point on this?
Yeah.
If you take a look, what do we really know? If you take a look at the debate that's going on between Eric Davis and Jacques Sarfati, and you have a Nobel Prize winner, it's in on this list or whatever, and these two guys are fighting about levitating a little piece of metal, like a layered piece of metal off the table. I mean, if they're fighting about the physics of levitating this piece of metal, do we really have anything? And these would be guys, if you're in a Nobel Prize, you're sort of in the field of physics. If something's going on, Sarfati said that, if something was going on, I would know. And I'll give you the Canadian perspective. In the 1950s, Wilbur Smith was with the guy that ran the flying saucer program. He was a contactee. And what he stated was that when he presented the material to the government, they realized there was nothing they could do about it. And so they closed their eyes and hoped it would go away.
Well, Jan, I want to talk to you also about this because I think Grant mentioned before the whole Ben Rich, Lockheed skunk work. Were you the guy that actually talked to Ben Rich?
I
And
was.
you were, can you tell us that? Because I don't want to put words in your mouth. What was
Well,
it?
no, so I'm a graduate of the UCLA School of Engineering, where Ben had graduated many years before me, and he was retiring from the Lockheed Skunk Works. In fact, he had retired, and they had invited him to come speak to the alumni, the engineering alumni, which about 200 people showed up for this event, about his 40 years at the Lockheed Skunk Works. So it was supposed to be a very mundane talk. In fact, Stephen Justice has told me that he's the guy who put the pitch together, although he denies that they had any kind of technology that Ben alluded to, but hold that for a thought. So this was about 40 slides of the 40 years, starting with the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71, which made Ben Rich famous and allowed him to take over for Kelly Johnson, all the way up to the last slide. And it was pretty mundane stuff. It was just aircraft they had built, some of them that never saw the light of day. Very interesting talk. But his last one was a black disc zipping off. These were slides. A black disc zipping off into outer space. And he ended the talk by saying, "We now have the technology to take ET home." He might have said something on the front end about an Air Force contract, but we now have the technology to take ET
You
home.
heard this yourself. I just want to make that clear. So
Yeah,
you-
well, so the interesting thing is I was sitting there with Tom Keller, who's a good friend of mine, and he writes for the MUFON Journal. And we were sitting there, and when he said that, the entire room burst out laughing. They thought he was joking. And he and I just looked at each other and said, "Did he really just say that?" I mean, we couldn't believe he'd actually said that. So after the polite I call it the polite Q&A ended, and people were dispersing, about 20 people huddled around Ben, and we spent some more time talking to him. And during that discussion, I won't take you through, I'll shorten it up here. But basically,
It's interesting. No, it's fascinating. I think this is the most fascinating part of some of this research, your personal experience. So you give us a bit of the story. Yeah.
well, let me just go back to his talk. In his talk, he had a couple different parts that I found very, very interesting. One was he thought that the heavy burden of security in the intelligence community. I mean, he talked about they'd have guys in suits with sunglasses on standing in the room where they were building the craft, like the F-117, which we know now exists. And he said it was just oppressive. He says, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, this stuff should be out to the free world. He was really pushing for whatever technology they had in the black to be now brought out in the light. I saw that in his demeanor. He also said another thing, which I found very fascinating, and this is 1993. He said, "There are no secrets in the world. There are no secrets in the world." And he didn't explain himself. And I thought to myself many years later, like 8 years later, when 9/11 happened, well, if there were no secrets in the world, how'd that happen? You know, how does that happen without people knowing about it? So, and I've been told by other people, there's reasons for that, but that's neither here nor there. But
Right.
So I'm talking to him afterwards, and he's talking to the group, and he says, "You know, we figured out how to work stealth because we took a Russian mathematician's equations, and our engineers studied those equations, and we determined that we could hide a craft by building a craft that followed these equations. That's why the F-117 looks so ugly. It's panels here, panels there. It's very angular. In fact, Kelly Johnson told Ben that it was the ugliest aircraft he'd ever seen in his life. But it can hide from radar. Well,
Okay,
similarly,
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Similarly, how you travel interstellar is through the same set of equations. And I actually asked him what the equations were, but he wouldn't tell me. I now know that it was Einstein's general theory of relativity. But he said there was an error in the equations. We figured it out, and we now know how to travel to the stars, and it won't take us our lifetime to do it. That's an exact quote out of his mouth.
Did he say something though about how to control the craft? That's the punchline. I
Well,
was looking.
now this ties into what Grant was talking about. As after about 25 minutes with these people, he turned around and said, "I got to go," and he started to walk out. And I chased him out of the room. We were still in the room, but I was at the end of the room. And I said, Ben, I said, "Thanks so much for the great talk." I said, "I have a question for you. Like, I'm really fascinated. Like, how does this propulsion work?" I was trying to get him to say something. And he looks at me, he's trying to figure out who I am and why I'm asking the question. And he said, "Well, let me ask you a question. How does ESP work?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I wasn't expecting to answer a question to a question." So I just blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. I said, "Well, I don't know. All points in space and time are connected." He said, "That's how it works." He turned around and walked away. So,
Wow.
if all points in space and time are connected, then we're all part of the same organism, right? I mean, consciousness all comes from, I mean, it's all tied together. You know, I wish I understood it too, but like Nick, I don't study consciousness. That's not my thing, but
well, it's up to some people do, but no, thank you, because I wanted to hear that story from you, because a lot of people repeat that story that you just said, and it's great to just hear it from you.
Just as a point on
Yeah.
that was the Dr. Eric Walker, who we chased for 8 years. 2 years before that, we were asking him about MJ12, the control group, and he was the guy that basically started DARPA. He had 14 honorary doctorate degrees, president of Penn State University, an advisor to President Eisenhower. We were asking him about, how does MJ12 work? How many people? Is it all Americans? And he said, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And then the guy couldn't answer the question. He said, look, unless you understand about ESP, you will not be taken in by the control group. Very few people understand how it works. So that was the thing. It's like, it came up a couple of times. And to add to what Jan said, Hal Puthoff went to Ben Rich immediately, correct? And he was trying to track it down, because that's my understanding, is that the problem is they talk about this stovepiping thing, where I was told, I did an interview with Richard Doty, and he was talking about pieces being brought to Hal Puthoff. So the idea is you take the flying saucer, you take it into little pieces, you bring one to a biology department, one to an engineer and stuff like this, and it's all this stovepipe, and nobody knows what anybody else is doing. And that's why they're not getting anywhere, because there's not one unified organization where people are allowed to talk to each other.
Well, let me talk to the Hurtaks who study both the hardware and the aspects of consciousness. So how do you bring those two together?
Well, let me start with Hal Puthoff's name was mentioned, and he is to the Stars Academy as well. He was the one with Russell Targ and Ingo Swann, who in the 70s actually started the whole program in the United States at Stanford Research Institute on remote viewing. And the idea that you can project your consciousness and go somewhere. So if I wanted to bring all this together with a consciousness understanding, I think some of the vehicles, and this has been from some of the research that people talk about, that they actually do project their consciousness and put that into the code instead of having to drive or figure out numbers. They simply go right there and the ship can be there. Ingo Swann did this. He actually looked at things on the Jupiter and Saturn and identified things
before the American probes. So we're talking about what some call thought form technology. And with some of this research has gone into a book called Mind Dynamics in Space and Time with some of the colleagues of Hal Puthoff and others that we've worked with. Basically, it's the real X-Files, that the government had a top secret project to look at the potential of human consciousness to reach out.
I also want to add, and just to bring everyone up to stuff on terms of science, some of this all ties in, and Mind Dynamics talks about this, in quantum physics, and the idea of entanglement and non-locality. So the research of Elizabeth Rauscher, who we and her wrote that book, Mind Dynamics, and also Russell Targ, they said, okay, if you're going somewhere and going to see something on the other side of the planet and bring it back, what's the time delay? And they said none. And that was the shock, is that basically you are there and we can do this. They've shown it. They showed it in the 70s.
So our mind is embedded in a universal consciousness. You would call it a cosmic mind that we're all a part of.
But that's just not the mind. But if you're talking, Grant, and you're saying also Jan, that the vehicle also goes in the same direction, that it doesn't have to be just consciousness. It can actually be physical reality, as physical as the UFOs are.
So we need a thought process to be, as it were, the should we say, the dynamic to get all of this off the ground.
But I have to say one thing. I do think that we have gained some levels of technology, as Jan was indicating, from maybe the Russians or maybe other extraterrestrials. We do feel that vehicles are in our possession. We think even aliens, and I'd love to hear Nick's idea on this, have had some communication with government agencies. And so, you know, there are some advancements, maybe not, they're not giving it to us on a silver platter, they're making us work for it, but I think some advancements have come from our interaction with them.
Yeah, I want to hear from Nick too, because I don't want to leave the nuts and bolts behind, because it does seem like governments, whatever they are, have to start, okay, we got this, and they're not just going to jump into, yeah, it's all about the mind and consciousness, ESP. So Nick, was there talk in your government about anything beyond nuts and bolts?
Very, very occasionally. I think when you're dealing with people in in government, the military, the intelligence community, when you've got these people going for funding every year to the Treasury for the various defense programs, it is a very nuts and bolts world, and you do not want to be going into the room talking about consciousness. However interesting it may be, however real it may be, it just won't cut any ice with the sorts of people that you're dealing with. So it's very occasionally. But there was one interesting example. The Ministry of Defense, very shortly after 9/11, did do a study into remote viewing. Now, of course, as all of you will know, probably far better than I, the US government had a number of remote viewing programs, Grill Flame, Starstreak, Sunstreak, Stargate, etc. The British Ministry of Defense, we looked at it too shortly after 9/11, but it was so politically sensitive, the idea that you would be even using very small amounts of taxpayers' money to look at something like this. It would have been a gift to some of the critics who would have tried to maybe instigate wider defense cuts, because they would have said, well, if you're spending money on this, obviously you've got too much and you don't need as much for aircraft carriers and stealth fighters and whatever. But we did this study, but what we did is that, rather like the ATIP program, we put it out, although it was commissioned by the Defense Intelligence Staff. It was actually, the work was carried out by a contractor, a defense corporation. And this enabled us to do two things. I mean, firstly, it put a little bit of clear blue water between government and essentially looking to see whether ESP existed. And the results of our study, by the way, were inconclusive, but on a couple of occasions, it did say that the subjects seemed to have accessed some elements of the targets. And then it went on to talk about if this ever turned into an operational remote viewing program, and it was not clear whether that was ever done or not.
They weren't in touch
they
with
would,
the CIA then. And
well, they would go after, they would go after what it was termed the real targets. But as I say, such was the sensitivity that to take it outside of government, we put it out through a contract. And that, of course, made parliamentary scrutiny more difficult, and it made Freedom of Information Act journalism more difficult. But we did look at it briefly.
Right, which is why probably Stanford Research Institute was outside the government. But Jan, when you talked to Ben Rich and he said we have the technology to take ET home, does that mean back in '93 we were going interstellar? I mean, what's
this is the big, question, right? I mean, do we have the technology or don't we have the technology? It seemed to me from what he was saying is that we do have the technology, but I've heard from Stephen Justice and others, oh no, we know how it works. So interestingly enough, when that happened and it got published, I didn't talk about this for probably 10, 15 years. And then Tom Keller came to me and said, do you mind if I write an article about what happened to us? I said, no, go ahead. I didn't talk about it because I knew that it was probably so top secret that if I did, that there might be some repercussions. So I just kept it to myself. But he also did the same talk at Wright-Patterson, and they actually filmed that talk, although I haven't been able to get my hands on the film of it. So lose my train of thought here.
Where are we going? Where was
that?
Interstellar? No, Interstellar, the possibility.
Well, I personally think we've got the technology. Now, everybody I've ever talked to who's inside says, no way, no, we don't have it. It's never happened. And I see Grant shaking his head no. So, but here's what happened. After that article came out, only one physicist called me, and it was Hal Puthoff. Now, most people maybe don't know, but Hal's been a 25, 30-year member of MUFON, a long-standing member of MUFON. And he asked me, Jan, tell me exactly what Hal said to you. And he wanted word for word for word. And I took him through the whole thing. I took you guys through a blip of it, but I took him through the whole thing. And about a week or two went by and he called me back again. He said, Jan, now take me back through that again, right? I took through the same thing, and then he went away for years. And then all of a sudden he popped up on TTSA's stage back in October of 2017. And so after I saw him on that live Facebook feed, I called him up. I said, hey, Hal, congratulations. I see you're out of the closet. maybe you can come talk at a symposium now, because I've been inviting him for 20 years to speak at a symposium, and he won't come. It's not because he doesn't want to speak, it's because he's got government contracts. He doesn't want to screw them up. I understand that. So he basically, I said, so it sounds like you guys have figured this out. He said, yeah, we found the error in the equations. We know how it works. He says, these guys who are coming here, wherever they are, wherever they're from, they're ripping small holes in space-time and they're traveling into our space-time. And that's how they're getting here. And we know how it works. He says, the problem is either it takes a huge mass or it takes a very strong electromagnetic field to warp things to the point where you can get that little rip, where you can go to the other place in space and time. He says, but we're working on it, and we just need to fund it. And I think, personally, I think that's what the whole thing of TTSA is. They're trying to take that knowledge, these equations, and they're trying to build it. Now, whether they'll get funding or not, I don't know.
What do you think, Dr. Hurtak, about that?
A researcher by the name of Robert Forward was working with the American Air Force many years ago to look at zero-point energy, something that Hal Puthoff was deeply involved with. And so there has been work behind the scenes in terms of what I would call new physics of consciousness. So what we're looking at is really the need for 4 vertical roadmaps. One dealing with the new technology, a second, a need for a new sociology of the contact experience to diminish culture shock. Thirdly, a new psychology of recognizing that science and consciousness can eventually unite on the higher threshold. And 4, new planetary science, recognizing that we're not alone in the universe. We need a new cosmology. Excuse me. We need a new cosmology to wake up people to realize that we are potential cosmic citizens.
Well, Desiree, that we don't want to leave behind the hardware when we do that. I mean, yeah, it's all spiritual, it's all consciousness, but there's many different levels. There's the government, and there's the, who said that only 50% of the people really care. So how do we really awaken with this revelation by the Pentagon to these new realities?
Well, I go back to MUFON. I mean, I think that there has to be more and more sightings. Jan, are there getting to be more and more? I keep asking that. Is there an exponential increase in information that you're getting from people? And not everyone's going to,
especially during this crisis.
They should.
Well, so there's not an exponential growth in the number of sightings, because the sightings are the sightings, and they've always been there, right? In fact, it's been very constant over time until, of course, we got to the Starlink satellite. Now they're buzzed up. We know what those are, those IFOs. But I think what we need to do is a couple things. One is we need to figure out what it is we can talk about. When DeLong announced TTSA, he mentioned the fact that there were things that were things that never should have been secret. There are things that were secret then that don't need to be secret now. And there's things that never should be known to anybody. And I don't know, that gets me very curious. What's the third one? But maybe we need to figure out what it is we can talk about, and we need to align with our governments, with our military, with the people of this community, and get down the road, because it's going to be a big hill to climb to get this planet on board with what you're talking about. I mean, it's just a huge hill.
You should talk to Nick Pope. Nick Pope's still sworn to secrecy, right, Nick? About things you can't tell us.
Yes. But let me jump in with one quick thought on all this. When it comes to interstellar travel, this isn't just a nice to have, it's a must have. One day, we can't go on dodging bullets forever here on planet Earth. One day, if we don't have viable interstellar travel, the human adventure will end right here, whether it's global pandemic, whether it's nuclear war, whether it's comet or asteroid impact, whether it's runaway climate change, whatever it is. So ultimately, we will have to go to the other planets in the solar system. But further than that, when our sun expands, we will have to go interstellar. But that will be, so it may be that the technology is beyond us at present, even if we understand the theoretical physics. It goes back to what I was saying about the engineering. This will be a program, I think, orders of magnitude above and beyond the Apollo program, the Manhattan Project. I mean, it will be trillions and trillions of dollars, but it's something ultimately we will have to do.
Right.
Agreed.
Desiree, yeah, you were
Yeah,
saying.
if I can add, you mentioned Interstellar, and I think that was a great movie because it exactly exemplifies what you were talking about. But also what Grant was saying a little bit is that it's not so cut and dry. I wish it was all nuts and bolts. It would be more easier to talk about, but these intelligences, and I say that there's more than one form of intelligence that seems to be coming here, mentioning going through kind of stargates or wormholes. I mean, this is not just some guy that, you know, decides to come and visit our planet because he's touring the local universe. I mean, there's a lot going on out there, a lot of different forms of intelligence, a lot that don't seem so three-dimensional. Some are seeming to be able to cross space and time, fifth dimension.
Called the ultra-terrestrial.
We think this is really hard, why the government has not really come out with, you know, talking about it. They don't know, they can't explain the vast reality that has been visiting this planet, and we would say even for thousands of years. But I'm very excited that the releases are coming and that we can talk about the physical realities of, you know, fleets of vehicles, not just one. That's what the guy said on that video. You know, there's a fleet of them. And I think that's amazing. And this is exactly what astronaut Gordon Cooper said, because we wrote about it in a book that we were connected with, Sidney Sheldon's Doomsday Conspiracy, that he saw in the 50s, I think it was 52 or something like that, when they were flying right at the border of East and West Germany at the time. Both he and the Russians looked up. They were on some of the top planes that we could get at that time. They knew where they were. A flotilla of vehicles is what was seen in the 50s.
So what did they do to Gordon Cooper? Did they put him away in a crazy house? No, they made him an astronaut.
But
He
you
told
know,
the truth that we had multiple cosmic visitors.
Can,
No, we
can I
know
make,
Gordon very intimately. Before he died, he told us also some of his experiences, but that's for another program.
what are you saying, Grant?
can I make a statement about, we're talking about, you started with the video, with the Nimitz thing.
Yeah.
And what people have to remember with the Nimitz thing is I think it was Jacques Vallée said, it's a UFO sighting 15 years ago, time to get over it. And basically what you have to remember is that the government may actually be imitating what the beings are doing. And I have to call the theory of wow. So when you look at the Nimitz thing, what happens? They sit there and hover for a week, and then finally they get discovered, and then they start to chase. And then what happens? It drops from 80,000 feet down to sea level in 7/8 of a second. Now, why did the UFO do that? I mean, is this like a pre-abduction maneuver? Or no, it's like they're showing off. It's like, watch this. And everybody goes, holy cow. And then they go flying by, and then they say, come on, Zogar, they're coming. Go under the water and make big bubbles under the water. They're coming back. And they go under and people, and it's just a story. And then they go away and they don't come back again. So what we've got to remember is that whoever the intelligence is, they ain't disclosing either. They're doing the same thing, this drip, 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 show this, move to a different place. Because there has not been, the Nimitz was 15 years ago, and they didn't come back. They had that very defined exposure. They made everybody look like go wow, and then they took off, and then they do something else, and they go and shut down a couple of nuclear missiles, and they're just sort of showing us, and it's almost like, I think Jacques Vallée said it. It may be just a giant kabuki theater, and the only message is we aren't alone.
Well, that's what's so frustrating about this disclosure. We're getting like crumbs, and Nick said there's probably tons of video footage that Air Force has. And why don't we, and Richard Dole and Linda Moulton House says, just give us the whole thing. Just give us the whole truth. Let the public decide. Why are you telling us what we need to hear? That's, yeah.
Okay, but if you're talking about Elizondo says we're here to defend the American people. So if you're a military guy, you're looking at it like it's a card game. It's you and the Russians, and say, okay, Alan, put your cards on the table. I'll show you my cards. And you put your cards on the table and say, oh, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to disclose anymore. Thanks for the piece I'm missing, and walk away. So it's this mentality that we're up against everybody else, and everybody's in a race, and the guy who gets it runs the world, and we're going to build bombs out of this. And it's the mentality that stops people from putting their cards on the
That's
table.
an old mentality. I think this virus crisis shows us we're not separate people.
But that's what Elizondo says. That's Elizondo. We're not here to satisfy the curiosity of the people. That's exactly what Bush told Carter. Curiosity on the part of the president is not sufficient need to know.
Well, we have a need to know because we've been in this, and I think this could really help us. And the whole idea about self-defense, or that's an old story, and I don't know if it
You
works.
have classified material. You do not have the need to know. The military will say you do not have a need to know.
Well, what if we do have a need to know because it could really save this planet? I mean,
You
I
have to-
don't know.
Then it's up to us to force it.
Well, Nick, do we have a need to know? Or is it like coming out with the truth? Anyway, no matter what.
Yeah, I really can't speak to that because I don't know the full picture of what the United States government actually knows or possesses. I can only speak for the British government, and even then, not officially. Now I've left. All I can say is that in the UK, we have been as open as possible, and we don't have a sort of spaceship in a hangar smoking gun. If the United States does, well, good luck to them, but I don't know that, so I can't speak to it.
So JJ, can you tell us, we'll start to wrap this up. What do you think the future of contact disclosure, this whole road that is just, it's almost at our fingertips. We can almost touch it, but it's not quite here. What can we expect and what should we do?
Well, I concur with Grant is presently working on, which is the psychological and spiritual ramifications of where we go with the new model of contact. I feel we need a new psychology or a new paraphysics to open the door to realize that we're part of an entanglement of consciousness with the cosmic others. They're teaching us to put the pieces together, and we must put together what I will call university without walls through global media, through more disclosure programs, but basically to put this all together, a new psychology of a new picture of how we are part and parcel, part of a larger family in the universe. We are in a vast and awesome universe taking our baby steps. And talking to several ex-astronauts who were very excited, I think we're on a cusp of a great change that's coming that requires a raising of consciousness, recognizing that spirituality / higher psychology and extraterrestrial technology are interchangeable. We must understand that there's a whole thought process, a whole language of light, if you use a metaphysical label, a process through which our mind can open up to these cosmic events, in which we realize, as the SRI studies, Stanford Research Institute studies showed us, the human body is a multidimensional vehicle. The human being is a local as well as a non-local creation in the vast process of cosmic evolution. We need, as it were, a new roadmap. And all of us are part of this. And this is a great discussion we're having today to realize that the Pentagon papers / events are just the tip of a vast iceberg that's going to melt, I believe, in the next few years.
And if I can continue this, they are showing up at strange times. Of course, 2004, like you said, over certain nuclear weapon silos. Also 2014 off the coast of the Atlantic, at least in terms of the United States. They're not just dropping in again. They are tuned in. They know what's going on. They not only know what's going on with our news and with our reports and what our government's planning to do, they have telepathic ability. I think the more and more people go into this, they are actually tuned in exactly to what's happening. So they have their own disclosure program, if I can put it that way, same that we do, a little tidbit here, a little tidbit there, but it seems that they are watching and they are caring a little bit. I think that's the important thing. People don't have to be afraid. They haven't killed us to this point, that they seem to be dropping little hints, maybe helping with the technology. And this is going to allow us to graduate into the cosmos when we're ready, I think, to put away our weapons of war. But even if we don't, we may still have to graduate fairly soon. So that's very important, that knowing that they are part of our own consciousness reality.
There's a comment in the chat. It says by unidentified, if you check the quote made by astronaut Gordon Cooper, he said it was fear or panic about who may be flying the UFOs. That was the reason for extreme secrecy, as in the 1938. But I want to go to Jan and say, what does the future of MUFON, of UFOs look like? You're right there at the center. You're hearing all the report. What do you think is coming down the line from the government and people's awareness?
Well, I mean, I'm hopeful that there'll be more disclosures. I mean, I think we're sitting on a pile of data there with these videos and things that people can begin to release. I think the pushback is that just watching this virus and the negative impact it's had on so many people. I mean, we've created a worldwide lockdown over this little thing. We've had viruses for tens of thousands of years. That's nothing new to the human race, a virus. So now you tell them that there's beings out there, oh, and they're so far advanced that they can manipulate space and time. And oh, yeah, I mean, for the 50% who are not bought into the concept, that's fear and panic that you're going to put into those folks. So for those of us who are already on the other side of the Kubler-Ross grieving curve, and by that, Kubler-Ross 50 years ago came up with that there's 5 stages of grieving, and that's what we're going through right now is a grieving process. Denial is the first stage. We have a pile of people behind the denial wall in our government, in the White House. I mean, you know, they're not bought into this yet. They need to get bought in. Second is anger. They're going to have to be angry because how come you didn't tell me this? You know, why didn't I know? And then bargaining, and then depression, and finally acceptance. So all of us are down here at the acceptance side. We accept this. I mean, we're off on new adventures, consciousness, whatever. But the vast majority of the public is not. They're back behind the denial wall, and we've got to break that dam and get it going this way. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, we're from MUFON's perspective. I mean, we're trying to encourage scientists to do work in this area. We've got people working on faster than light. The problem is they're not being funded. That needs to happen. I know Grant said some things about Lou, but I think what Lou and Chris are trying to do is they're trying to work behind the scenes and the TTSA guys to get our congressional people up to speed, to get them to begin to fund some of these things. You cannot create this kind of technology and bring these things to the public and to the good of the public if you don't have funding. And that's been the, you know, between the governments and the intelligence community basically making this whole thing a laughingstock. Funding has been the other thing that has kept us back from doing anything really significant in this field.
Funding of what? What are we funding?
Well, funding research into this area, funding the research into it, right? Yeah, it's great that Kit Green and these other guys and Eric Davis and Al Putoff have gotten some money through some of these DARPA programs or however they got the money. But the fact is we need the rest of our scientific community, our universities, our private corporations, the IBMs of the world, the Googles of the world, these guys have research budgets. Why aren't they putting some of it to work on this stuff? I think that'd be more important than trying to build the next best Facebook, market data gathering mechanism.
Right. Well, thanks. So Grant, I want to ask you, we'll wrap up here, just another round. Is there a bridge between those two worlds of nuts and bolts we got with Nick Pope and the kind of consciousness that the Hurtaks represent? Can we connect those two, or do you have to like totally leave one and say, no, it's not all that?
Well, the funding thing is still going to go to nuts and bolts, that you're going to build, bigger ships and bigger planes and stuff like that. It's still, people aren't in that world yet. If I was going to look at what I think is the way it's working, is I think TTSA, what's going on behind the scenes, I think they're doing a good job in terms of what they're doing. And they're using the indirect method. So they're not coming into your face and saying this is for real. They're using the Hollywood method. So they're putting these things out so that a skeptic can turn it on, say there's a bunch of bunk, and sit there and watch it, and actually get sort of brainwashed as to what's going on. And if you want to know what's really going on, I think you got to look at the guy who was behind this whole thing, who spent tens of millions of dollars on this whole operation, Bob Bigelow. He gave an interview to George Knapp in 2013. And in that interview, he said, "Are you in favor of disclosure?" And Bigelow said, "No, I'm not. I'm in favor of confirmation. First, you have to confirm it's for real. And then once the people, after a couple of years, they get used to it, then you can go to what is the intelligence, who's behind it and stuff." That's exactly what they did. They did the confirmation thing. And if you take a look at Bigelow, he ties in the consciousness thing, which people keep forgetting. He put in $3.7 million to the University of Las Vegas, Nevada, into consciousness study because his son died. And so that's why they went to Skinwalker Ranch. They didn't go because of UFOs. They went because of the paranormal, the apport material, all the putting the bulls in the trailer. How do you get something to go through metal? It was that sort of paranormal thing. And that's what I'm saying. It's all the same thing. John Alexander's just come out and said this. It's all the same thing. It's all going to be the same underlying consciousness as the basics. And so when you go to Skinwalker Ranch, they knew that it was this other phenomena. It was this paranormal phenomena and the portals and stuff like that. So if you look at Bigelow sort of spelled out what's going to happen here. There's this consciousness link, but you can't bring the consciousness link in, because I've talked to a lot of really rich people. I remember one really rich person came to me and said, "Grant, how the hell do you make any money at this damn thing? Unless there's money, unless there's a contract. If you're going to say, I'm going to build a bigger boat or a bigger plane, you're going to get money. But if you say, I'm going to work on consciousness, who cares? It's not going to make any money." That's why the nuts and bolts has to stay in place, because you're just not going to sell it to Congress. And that's why they've used the threat thing. They're using the threat thing to get the money to say, maybe this is going to happen, and Scared to Live in Daylight, show them the film and say this is for real, convince them it's for real, then say it's a threat, and then get the money and use it to hopefully make a better world. But I don't know.
So the Hurtaks, if we concentrate on this idea of, let's say, consciousness, Grant says, is that seems to me the avenue for real progress. There'll always be nuts and bolts things we can play with, but how are we really going to meet the others? Because there obviously has to be beings that are creating these crafts. So how do you feel we're actually going to meet these beings?
We have to understand, first of all, that the Department of Defense, DOD, is not G-O-D, God. The life itself is God. And we're going through this great reevaluation of where we go from this point forth. In essence, it's the open-mindedness that we must maintain, the positive attitude to seeing the universe as a university, the graduation from humankind into space kind. It's a joyous process, but also it has its momentary setbacks. And I think we're ready to take this leap into the future with a greater information base. And Desiree and I have been privileged to work with some of the best scientists in the world, not only in the United States, but in Brazil, in South Africa, and Europe, all have come to the conclusion that consciousness is really the missing part of quantum transitions. Consciousness is the hidden variable from quantum transitions. Consciousness is the hidden variable for bringing the spiritual and the scientific together. So this is the critical mass that we must focus on as we reconnect ourselves ultimately with our cosmic counterparts. They want us to grow up and come out of schoolhouse Mother Earth into the cosmic universe.
And I'm all for technology, electromagnetic energies. People have been looking at free energy technologies, using that for a long time. I think there's pathways that we have to be able to take to get to free energy to help our own society. And I think many people are moving in that direction. If people want to know, we'll say Hal Puthoff's first gig, I would recommend people to look at Russell Targ's movie called Third Eye Spies, which is on Prime on Amazon. And it showed what got them the money, which is interesting. There's a couple of things that they are amazingly did, but one of the things that got them the money is by accident, they spied on the NSA.
And green belts.
And they actually got information inside the file cabinet drawers of this top secret programs. That's my favorite part in the movie. But it's if extraterrestrials are able to do the same, and I think they are. They're actually more adept at it than we are because we haven't used our remote viewing capabilities. They can do all the same thing. And I think hopefully that'll help us start moving forward and realizing our own potential.
So this shows there's no secret information. We're all interconnected. And as we began to understand the greater role of consciousness, we began to understand that we are being, in some ways, prepared for this great advancement.
And it reminds me of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I'm sure everyone's watched that. I mean, why were these people building little mountains in their living room? Just because they saw an extraterrestrial. That's how it works. There's this biochemical connection between us and them once you've seen something. And that's the real strange situation.
The bottom line is we're multidimensional beings waking up in the vast and awesome universe, realizing that we've got friends.
No, but I mean, I appreciate this conversation because there's the whole range of how we approach this topic. So, Nick, I go back to you. Are we looking now as in the baby steps for confirmation that Grant mentioned? Is this what the Pentagon strategy you might think is?
Well, I don't know what their strategy is, but clearly there is more to come, more videos, more forward-looking infrared films of UFOs being chased by military jets, more documentation. We know the president confirmed that he attended a brief meeting on this. A number of senators on the Armed Services, on the Armed Services Committee, on the Intelligence Committee have confirmed that they've been briefed. So there is a paper trail here. We know, for example, one Freedom of Information Act request turned up the fact that there was a video classified secret relating to the Nimitz incident, which had not been released. that there were briefing slides that were classified top secret. And of course, the definition of top secret information is information the disclosure of which would cause exceptionally grave damage to the national interest. So one has to, A, acknowledge that there's a lot more information out there, but B, acknowledge and accept that because we're dealing with highly classified, deeply compartmentalized programs, getting this out will be a slow process, and some things may be forever beyond the pale. I want to make just one brief point about, and it's speculative, but about extraterrestrials themselves, I guess.
Yes.
And I would say this, given that in our own history on planet Earth, one can say, depending on estimates, but the ape-human split took place somewhere between 5 and 7 million years ago. Given that we're in a universe nearly 14 billion years old, there might be civilizations out there with a head start, even taking account star formation, etc. 1 billion years, 2 billion years head start on us. And if the ape-human split was just 5 to 7 million years, what might the split, what might the difference in technology, science, consciousness, understanding, whatever you term all this, between us and those sorts of civilizations be? And it might, I mean, I hope we get the answers, but the Astronomer Royal in the United Kingdom once came out with a very famous quote on extraterrestrials, and he said, it might be forever beyond our conception. It might be like trying to explain quantum physics to the chimpanzees. And this time, we're the chimpanzees.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Jan, do you want to say anything about MUFON as we wrap up and your work? And also you want to comment on the Space Force that just, for some reason, just appeared out of nowhere in a way. The US, I mean, what's that all about?
Well, I don't know what it's all about. What the story is that it's about all these satellites of the different parts of the military are putting up into space, and the fact that they wanted to pull it all together. I think it's also about the Chinese. I think that we're fearful if we lose the high ground to another nation on this planet, we're going to be subjugated to where kind of England is today, 100 years after, or 200 years after the U.S. kind of took things over. So I think there's
Wait
a lot
a minute.
of talking around.
You
Well,
think
no,
you've
but,
taken things over?
If you look at world powers back
Good,
to,
our plan worked.
Sound like the ETs, right?
I think you still run us. We just don't know it. But so I think it's two things. I think it's the satellite thing, and I think it's the Chinese threat, if you will, from a global dominance type thing. I'm hopeful that it might also be that maybe we have some craft out there we'd like to put under the command. I don't know. That might be a far fetch. So that's all I can say about the Space Command. We'll have to see how it shakes out.
Right.
As far as MUFON goes, we're just going to continue doing what we're doing, putting the information out. We're trying to find other avenues to get the information out. We're working with researchers to look at the data.
The information being what? Do you want to specify what MUFON actually does?
Yeah, well, we get 500 to 1,000 sightings a month. So we try to call through them and get the cases of interest. And then we try to take the very best of those and write them up and put them on the website, put them out on social media, and make them available to people. So I'm working with a lot of media people, television shows and different things to provide content for them. MUFON is. We're working with scientists to give them information and data they need to go do studies into this whole area. So we're trying to push it, out. We're publicly funded. I mean, there's no, we have no connection to the government whatsoever. So we're doing what we could do. We're doing our part. I think, it's time for us to kind of start looking at some of this stuff and figure out what is it that we should be talking about and what is it they don't want us talking about. I think it's perfectly fine, personally, the interactions I've had within government to talk about UFOs. ET seems to be a little bit iffy. They definitely don't want you talking about how the technology works. I mean, that's what I'm getting. So fine, let's draw some boundaries and let's get going because it's time to move on. We need to move on this planet, and that's what MUFON's about.
Have there been more or less sightings during the lockdown? I guess maybe people are going out.
It's been more, but it's been more. But a lot of those have been the Starlink.
What's the Starlink?
Which
they
is
said-
Elon Musk, and he's going to be turning them off. So anytime you see a straight line of what looks like UFOs, it's probably the Starlink. He's putting up
Yeah.
about 400 satellites. So are other people, but he's going to start turning them off so we won't see them. I don't know if he can do
Oh,
that.
I
I don't know if you can do it either.
What's the MUFON website for people who want to report a sighting? Is what?
MUFON.com, MUFON.com.
Okay.
And just
Okay.
click on report a UFO.
Thanks for being there. Any final words about our discussion, the Pentagon, anything like that you want to?
Well, I think what's interesting to me is that we're still talking about the U.S. Navy, and
Right.
yet where's the U.S. Air Force in this whole thing? Aren't they supposed to be in charge of our skies? And the thing that never gets talked about is NORAD. I mean, NORAD has the technology to track every little piece of junk the size of a quarter coming in and out of this planet space. So if anyone knows what's really going on, it would be the guys at NORAD. And I find it fascinating that data, that's just totally off limits. So I'd like to see more forthcoming on the part of the government, on the part of the Pentagon, on the part of our military and intelligence communities to put this information out. We could do it in a thoughtful way so we don't panic the general public, but it needs to be a faster drip than where it's coming. I mean, it's been 2.5 years since these videos showed up, and all we're doing is regurgitating the same stuff 2.5 years later. Let's put something new on the table. Let's move
2.5 years later from 16 years ago. That's even worse, you know. So, but
well, the time before that was 70 years ago, back in 1952, when the front page of the Washington Post was, you know, a jet fighter pilot chases a UFO. I mean, you haven't seen that on the front page of a newspaper for 70 years. Now all of a sudden it popped up 2 years ago, and we're talking about it. So we need to make it safe for our military people and government officials and everyone else, and scientists and engineers to work on this issue without being embarrassed about it. You know, we got to lose this 70 years of disinformation that was going on, and we need to move.
Ad Astra to the stars.
Yes,
Yeah.
Ad Astra. I agree. To the stars.
Okay.
We need to get there.
So Grant, how would you wrap up this whole thing? What do you think we have to look
Well,
forward to?
I would say maybe the American researchers are a little bit anxious. We want everything yesterday, and we want it like immediately, put it out. I've been in this since 1975, and I can tell you it's a completely different world. We know 1,000 times what we knew then. I think, to me, my personal thing is I really don't care what the government does or what the beings do or whoever is behind it or whatever. All I'm interested in is what am I supposed to do? What's my role in this thing? If you believe in the reincarnation thing, you believe you came in here for some sort of purpose, all I got to do is worry about what I'm going to do. And I think from what I've seen in my 45 years, it's a completely different world. People don't realize that. People know an awful lot more today. It used to be considered a random event. If you saw one UFO, you were crazy. If you were claimed you saw 2 UFOs, that was totally impossible. Now we know, I think a lot of what's going on, and it's just a matter of time. And we have to spell out what we ourselves are going to do to move the ball down the field, because we've probably all had experiences. So we're all dragged into this for whatever reason. And we have some sort of mission that we're supposed to do. And we just got to get busy doing what we're supposed to do in terms of why we're here and why we're involved in this crazy story.
Great. How can people find you, Grant?
Well, most of my stuff comes on my White House UFO YouTube channel. That's I do a lot of interviews with weird leading edge stuff, and that's where I put it. But that's about it. If they want to contact me by email, it's whitehouseuFO@gmail.com.
Thanks for your time. Before we go to the Hurtaks, Nick, I just want to ask you about, you mentioned in your New York Post article, the reason why you think the Pentagon released that information during this lockdown crisis. Was it so that they wouldn't pay much attention to it? I forgot what you actually said.
Well, I said there are 2 schools of thought. In the UK, we have a saying in the media, a good day to bury bad news. And this comes, it's a slight misquote of what a British government official said on the day of 9/11, when she said, if there's any bad news announcements that we've been meaning to tell Parliament, now's a good day to slip them out because everyone's looking the other way. So my first thought was this good day to bury bad news theory. But then I thought, you know what? The coverage has been so solid on coronavirus that actually the opposite turned out to be true. And I think this story did get a lot of traction. And I don't know, there's always a quality versus quantity issue. But for example, I did quite a lot with the BBC, and I did quite a lot with the British Forces Broadcasting Service on this. So maybe it's not the big audience, but arguably it's the important audience. And that was interesting. So the timing as ever is fascinating with this.
Great. And how can people find you and your work and maybe some of your books?
nickpope.net is my website, and that has links to information about my government work, my books, and links to my various social media presence. So nickpope.net.
Thanks, Nick. I'll be in touch. And Dr. Hurtak, how would you wrap this all up as far as going into the future and the human situation relationship to this phenomena?
Well, I just want to say, we were talking, of course, about the 2004 Nimitz experience. The world is seeing it all over the place. We have, of course, the British here, but at the same time, practically, there was a Campeche, Mexico event, also with a flotilla of vehicles in 2004. And that was about to be released at that time by the Mexican government. Supposedly something had blocked it. So there is more and more that has to get out. That is happening all over the planet. And I go with support MUFON to help document what you're seeing, get it as clear as possible. You have your cell phone, take the pictures if possible, and get this information out. So I think they're coming to the people right now. I think they're going beyond just the governments of what's taking place.
And we are the Academy for Future Science.org. So interested individuals in the SRI reports and some of the work that we do at Russell Targ and others behind the scenes are available through our...
Actually, our website is futurescience.org. And
someone just asked a question about the Mars. You're part of the Mars program. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
We're part of the Mars Society, and Dr. Hurtak's book, Keys of Enoch, actually
was the first to release the Mariner 9 B-frames of the pyramidal landforms on Mars in 1972-73. So we were out of the gate about 20 years before most, seen that historically speaking, the indigenous societies seem to have the longest track record in terms of identifying what we will call the architecture of life with the cosmic intelligence. So we are architects of the new dawn. We're forging a roadmap between the new working consciousness, parapsychology, and new science dealing with the higher dimensional possibilities of life, and the humanistic and compassionate side of what we must show others in this process of bringing the many viewpoints together. We have to recognize that it's up to us really to be the avant-garde of new information in a loving way and not in a dictatorial way, in a compassionate way, not in a one of fundamentalism and religiosity.
And certainly not with fear. We, like I said, they've been here probably for thousands of years, coming and going, watching us. And we do think we're at a threshold. I mean, this coronavirus could be part of that threshold of why they're coming. Certainly the situation of the Trinity site, the first nuclear bomb or atomic bomb, I think is the term at that time. That brought more and more sightings in the area.
So what we're saying is the divine spark really trumps the atomic event, that we're all part of the divine spark.
Well, I think we made some good ground today. I don't know if we resolved anything, but I think Desiree's right. All of us here on this call and probably listening online on the chat, we feel like we're at the edge of something. We are at a threshold. And I think the virus, whatever that is propelling us into a new awareness, a different awareness. It's like in 1 month, our reality has completely changed. Just think of how that might happen if we really get the news or the idea that we have company here, how that might change. So reality is very fragile. I think we're noticing. And I think what we've all tried to do here is put the little perspective about what we're seeing about the possibilities of our evolution and the awakening of something bigger than just us. So thank you all for being here. We're part of something bigger for sure. And these people on the screen with me are looking into what that is. So I thank each of you for being here, taking the time. I don't know if we've proved anything, but at least we've kicked the ball around a little bit, right?
Thanks for setting it up.
Yeah,
thank you.
thanks. I think I want to do more of this because I think it needs to be a conversation, and you guys were really the best I could find to talking about a public conversation. This is what we need to have. So, okay. I'll just
Thank
say,
you.
this is Alan Steinfeld for New Realities, and thank you for watching. I have some more upcoming streams, so look at this YouTube channel, youtube.com/New Realities, and a lot more exciting shows. And give me your feedback at newrealities@earthlink.net. Thank you all for watching. And